going to give today. I'm going to talk a little bit about flood history and some facts. We're going to go over knowing your risk, and I'm going to put this laser pointer here. The types of flooding that we get in the district, how we at the National Weather Service provide notifications and alerts, some mitigation measures that are taking place, and some closing comments. This is actually a picture of our forecast operations here out in Sterling, and we actually do have a window that the meteorologists can look out, which is really helpful. And the thing is, you'll see this sign cropping up a couple of times, and it's a general safety sign. When flooded, turn around, don't drown. And that means either if you're on foot or if you're actually traveling in a vehicle. So don't let this be you here. We're going to play a little video here. And this driver of this pickup truck down in Charlotte, he just drove through or around a barricade, and he's now in some serious trouble. It takes just 12 inches of flowing water to carry off a smaller car and 18 to 24 inches to carry off a larger vehicle. Fortunately, in this case, the driver was rescued, but more than half of the deaths occur from flooding are in vehicles. So I just wanted to show that little safety clip. So let's talk a little bit about local flood history, just give you a little bit of a history lessons. So did you know that the first recorded floods in this region were in 1748? Why 1748? Well, if you know your U.S. history, you know that in colonial times, there was a fellow named George Washington who, as a teenager, worked as a land surveyor for Lord Fairfax. So while surveying this area just to the northwest of here in 1748, a flood forced the surveying team to stay in an area that has been mapped by Thomas Jefferson's father, and this area was called Medicine Springs, which is today known as Berkeley Springs. Once discovering that area, actually Washington fell in love with the area, and he loved it so much he continued returning through colonial times as he grew up. There was a flood that occurred later in 1776 near Bath, Virginia. As that flood, maybe the same one, we're not sure, but it moved downstream. It affected a fellow named Robert Harper, who is named Harper's Ferry, who operated the ferry there upstream on the Potomac River. So you can see that the history of major events in this region date all the way back to 1748, because we have a pretty famous fellow kind of tracking that. All right, so floods. Floods are a major weather killer. And if you look at this chart here, this is National Weather Flood Fatalities in 2019, which are the red columns here. You've got flood over here, lightning, tornado, hurricane, heat, winter, cold, wind, and rip currents. The yellow is the 30-year average going back to 1990. The blue columns here are the 10-year averages. But if you generally look outside of heat, which has kind of been going down because we've been better prepared for heat deaths, flood deaths going back in 2019 are still very high. So flood is a real major weather killer. Now, in fact, there hasn't been a flood-related death in the district in quite some time, and we want to keep it that way. However, if you look around the district, there have been flood fatalities. And here are the locations of where those fatalities occurred. You can see up Ellicott City in Howard County, Maryland. That was back in 2016. There's been several in Fairfax County. This was back in 2011. Prince George's County had one back in 2013. So they're all kind of surrounding the area. And if you look at this region, essentially every year we get out an average between 1 to 2 deaths a year due to flooding. Most flood fatalities do occur in cars, and in fact, it's about 2/3. And they also occur at night, though not necessarily. So think about it. Why would they occur in cars? Well, you've got to go somewhere, and we have to get there. So we traveled that same route hundreds of times, if not thousands. It's been dry. We've had no issues. Why would today be different? Why? It's because you might encounter something like you see here that occurred on the morning of July 8th, 2019. This is along Canal Road, and the waters here came up, probably within 20 minutes or so when this picture was taken. So that road was dry, say 20 minutes earlier, and now it's turned into a stream or a river almost, and people are trapped, they're standing on their cars. And these people really weren't necessarily making bad decisions. They just got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. So flood safety, bottom line, if you come upon flood waters and you're out, typically turn around and go the other way. In this little video clip, you're going to see this truck kind of went over the road. But if you notice here on the side, there's kind of a cavity here that with time, this cavity starts growing. Again, and look at this after several minutes. The bottom line is it's never assumed that it's safe to drive through water. This roadway could be compromised. When flooded, turn around, don't drown. Okay, so knowing your risk. So if you check, we have something, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, they have flood maps to see if you're in a flood zone. And in fact, there's a great mapping website for DC called dcfloodrisk.org, and that's that first one here. You can actually go and look nationwide. But just as a caveat, this is the Potomac River. Washington, D.C. is here. This is the Anacostia River. This is Reagan National Airport, DCA. Flooding's not limited to these flood zones. It can occur anywhere. In major floods like you had with the tropical systems like back with Harvey in Texas, or with Hurricane Florence in South Carolina, or even Ellicott City, you had significant flooding that's going to occur well away from these river areas. So flooding can happen almost anywhere, and it's important to always consider the ways you can mitigate the potential losses. So this is essentially the blue area on this graphic from this DC Flood Zone, dcfloodrisk.org website. This shows the 1% chance flood zone. And in this case, what does that mean? So, and sometimes you may hear it referred to as the 100-year flood, but this is a poor use of terminology. So in reality, this area has a 1% chance of flooding in every year. Now, that may not seem like much, and it may not seem like a high risk, but kind of like the interest on a savings account, it does compound over time. So in a 30-year period, a structure in the 1% flood zone has about a 25 or 1 in 4 chance, 25% chance of being flooded. And those aren't great odds if you don't want to be flooded. So now let's talk about the types of flooding that affect the District of Columbia. The first and by far the most common type of flooding is what we call coastal or tidal flooding. And the most important thing to know about coastal flooding is it's not caused by heavy rainfall. And it can happen on a completely sunny day. In fact, most of the time it occurs on a completely sunny day. Coastal flooding only affects the areas close to the tidal shoreline. And what you see here is this little graphical demonstration. Water essentially for some reason, is getting pushed up from the south to the north, up towards Washington, D.C., and the water has nowhere to go, so it piles up and then it spreads out and it inundates areas. A lot of the most common areas affected in DC are places like East Potomac Park, Southwest Waterfront, areas in Georgetown. And we'll talk more about just how often it happens shortly. But again, remember, it's not caused by heavy rainfall. It really is the wind and the weather patterns pushing water up. The second type of flooding that we have is what we call interior flooding. And this is caused by heavy rain directly over or perhaps north of DC. And it can happen any time of the year. And we kind of discriminate two different types of interior flooding. We say we can get flash flooding, or we can get kind of what we call the urban street flooding, which is down more on the nuisance level. Although urban street flooding, from heavy rain can also inundate your basement, if you're in the wrong spot. The locations that are most impacted, Federal Triangle, you've seen examples of pooled water along Constitution Avenue. Small creek flooding, for example, on Rock Creek or Watts Branch. And you've probably seen pictures of the metro station, the escalator going down into Cleveland Park Metro, and there's water cascading down there. Those are essentially anywhere storm drains are overwhelmed. That's where you can get this type of flooding. And I'll talk a little bit about what is flash versus just regular flooding here in a minute. The third type of flooding that we get in the district is something that we call riverine or simply river flooding. And it's essentially, if you look at the animation here, it's water that's coming down the Potomac River from upstream areas who have probably had, heavy rain. It may not have rained a drop in DC, but maybe perhaps up in the panhandle of West Virginia or out towards Western Maryland, maybe they had 2, 3, 4 inches of rainfall over, a short time period. All of that water is going to drain eventually into the Potomac River, and the Potomac River is going to drain all of that down into the district. It's the least common, but historically it's the most impactful. The locations that you typically are impacted by this are the Georgetown waterfront, and all of the Potomac and the Anacostia shores. Usually if it rains pretty hard, upstream, it's going to take a while for that flood crest to move down to the district. So it's meaning that the flooding can happen again on a sunny day. And the same areas that are affected by tidal flooding down here up, through, where you have the dam at Little Falls, can experience riverine flooding. But the impacts from this river flooding are more severe, in the Georgetown than in the southeast part of the district. So just looking at the examples of flooding in DC, up here in the upper right, that's Park Service headquarters off of Ohio Street, and that's an example of some coastal tidal flooding. See the water nearly up to the door there. Flash flooding, that was the example from July 2019 on Canal Road. Here's some examples, some urban street flooding in the lower left here. And then this is essentially a hydrograph showing the blue is the observed water levels here at Little Falls, and then these dots are essentially the forecast. We'll talk a little bit about this in a while, but this is an example where you see this, monotonic rise going from action stage to minor stage to moderate stage flooding. Typically, I'll talk a little bit about what these levels mean, but when you start getting into the moderate stage, and especially in the major flooding, you're going to have structures that are going to be impacted. So let's take a little more depth look at these types of flooding. Coastal or tidal flooding. Here's a map that essentially shows wind direction. It shows the entire mid-Atlantic region from the Delmarva down to southeastern Virginia. Here's Norfolk, Washington is up here, Baltimore is here. And this is showing like the forecast winds that are moving water up the bay. And part of that water is going to come into the Potomac water, and it's going to get pushed up in there. So this coastal flooding is most severe when you have a wind direction like what I've shown here, especially, for a day or two. So that water's pushed up. And the most severe flooding occurs in the upper reaches of both Washington, D.C., and also in the Chesapeake Bay. If you look at the two typical peak seasons that we have for coastal or tidal flooding, We have two peaks. One is May and June, and the other is September and October. And there's a minor peak here in March, and typically during the core of the summertime, that's when it's the least, and also in the winter months, it's typically low. So this March peak can actually have a little bit of snowmelt combination in here. September is the month where we typically have the most coastal flooding. However, September, even though it has the most floods, it's definitely not because, you know, we have the most tropical storms there. It can happen anytime. Another factor that plays into this is the rise in mean sea level. And this graph shows going back to like 1925. It shows the trend line of rising water levels. And the average rate of rise is about a foot per century. And some of the rates here in the last couple of years have actually been above the mean of this sea level trend line. So what this really means for the district is that regardless of storms, rain, or anything else, flooding of the tidal shorelines in the district will continue to become more frequent, and eventually it'll be more impactful. Now, you know, I talked about, you know, we had this coastal and tidal, you know, flooding. We have something that we call nuisance flooding, which is what we've defined as minor flooding. And that, you know, that typically means you're going to get inundation of shoreline areas, but there's really not much impact because there's not many structures there. You might have some walk paths or maybe some side streets that flood due to minor flooding. So we define that as nuisance flooding. But this is steadily, the incidence of this is steadily increased over the last 50 years. And this, you know, we think is really due to the rise in the base water level to the mean sea level rise. And it's not due to an increase in storms. If you look at this little table graph down here for Washington, D.C. here, from 57 to 63, we averaged around 6 or so days, 5 or 6, you know, 5 to 7 days per year on average of nuisance. And then if you look at the period 2007 to 13, it's up to nearly 30. Probably right now it's up, you know, 2020, it's up to around 35 days a year. And that's a, you know, it's a huge increase. And especially if you look at closer to the Bay, you know, with Baltimore and Annapolis, their incidence is also going up, but it's even at a higher rate. Okay, so let's go back and talk a little bit about that second type of flooding, the interior flooding, and this is due to heavy rain. But first, let me talk about the difference between a flood versus a flash flood. You've probably heard those terms before. These are definitions here on this slide that the National Weather Service uses to determine what alerts to send to the public. And a flood is basically defined as any high flow, overflow, or inundation by water which causes or threatens damage, okay? Now, that flood could occur over a time span of hours or even a day. Contrast that to a flash flood. And a flash flood is a rapid and extreme flow of high water into a normally dry area. Think about Canal Road back in July 2019. Or a rapid water level rise in a stream or creek above a predetermined flood level, which requires immediate action on your part to protect your life and your property. Some of the reasons for flash flooding, the most common one around here is, you know, you get a period of, you know, several hours of heavy rain in, say, thunderstorms. Back in, I think it was late June of 2006, we just had hours of thunderstorms over the district, and it caused, you know, terrible flooding. Like I think the Department of Commerce building, the basement was flooded. Some of the roads were just inundated with water, but that was due to intense rainfall. The other things that can happen is, like in the wintertime, we can actually have ice jams on some rivers, and they build up a kind of a big pool of water, and then all of a sudden that gets released. That'll occur. We don't too much have to worry about dam failures around here, but basically you could have, a flood situation where we have a flood warning out, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the water could quickly rise, and if that's the case, then we'll put that word flash in there. The flash meaning rapid and extreme flow. If you look by month, and if you look at the flash flood warnings that our office has issued going back to the late 80s, there's essentially, and on this graph here, you have January on the left column, February on to the warm months, and then to the cool months, November, December. If you look at the, and then at the top here, 1986 down to 2019, if you can kind of see in this area, there's kind of a core, what I would call the warm season months, and that is essentially going to be flash flood warnings that are issued in response and prompted by thunderstorms. Thunderstorms produce very heavy rainfall rates in a short amount of time. You can get in this area rainfall rates of anywhere from 1 inch to 3 inches, even 4 inches per hour, and they can sustain that rate for several hours. With Ellicott City, flash flooding up there, they had around 6 to 7 inches of rainfall in about 2 hours. So it's pretty dramatic. In fact, a little known tidbit, probably about 50 miles north of here in Frederick County, or is it Carroll County, Maryland, I forget, but just north of the district, around 50 miles, the world record 1-minute rainfall is actually the current holder, and it was about 1¼ inches of rainfall in 1 minute. So this area, because of its proximity to the warm waters of the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean in the summertime, you can see tremendous rainfall rates. Now, typically September will also have flash flood warnings, but some of these might be related more to tropical systems. And why is it in the warm season that you have more flash flooding? It's just that the air mass is more humid. Like today, the dew points were in the lower 70s across the area, and there's just more moisture that the thunderstorm can ingest and then rain out, and that will increase the intensity. When does flooding occur? So if you say, well, what time of day does it occur? Well, first of all, it can occur anytime, day or night. So just remember that. Many flash floods occur at night or around sunset in the district. So here's a map for the Washington, D.C. region, and these are flash flood warnings and when we issue them. And between 6 and 7 o'clock are essentially about the peak time, but you kind of see a peak from around 3 p.m. until midnight. And you see the lowest peak is, probably, around, say, 6 to 8 a.m. So also take into account that at night, most flash flood fatalities occur. And that's because you just can't see it. So just remember that. But also be aware that, even though this minima is occurring between 6 and 8 o'clock, 6 and 9 o'clock, you can still get significant flash flooding, like I showed the Canal Road in July 2019. That actually occurred around 9 to 10 o'clock, maybe 8:30 to 10 o'clock. And that's down in this minima. So again, it can happen anytime, day or night. All right, so let's turn into river flooding. Luckily, our office, the Weather Service, does provide 3-day forecasts for the Potomac River, including the tidal portion of the river, every day, regardless of flood potential. So on our website, weather.gov/Washington, you can go and you can get these graphs that will show the observed values here for like Little Falls, and then you can also get Georgetown, you can get the Southwest DC location, and you'll see this forecast here for 3 days. Also, what we have up for Little Falls is we actually have what we call a 10-day river level probability forecast that is made. So here, what I would call this single deterministic forecast of water levels here at Little Falls, just upstream on the Potomac from DC. It stays below 5 feet. On this graph down here, the action stage here is 5 feet, but what you'll notice here is toward the end of this 10-day period here, this was back in early March, and the forecast was made in late February. This blue area in here represents a 25 to 75% most likely. In other words, 10 days from now, the water level is going to be somewhere in there. And then you have some other instances here where you have less likely up in here, but it's not out of the question. I would say use caution with these probability forecasts that are available. The deterministic is good, but this kind of gives you an idea here that there is a range of possibilities that you can see.
Steve, could I give you a 5-minute warning?
Sure, I'm pretty much getting close.
Great.
The DC Silver Jackets team developed a flood inundation mapping, which you can use for both the river and coastal flooding. I've got a website in here, and we can probably post that, Brent, into the chat. And you can actually click on this map, and it'll show you your flooding potential. Quickly on travel times, basically on river flooding, if you go back to the headwaters of the Potomac back in western Maryland, out in Garrett County, how long does it take the water here to drain down into the district? You can essentially drain from the top or the westernmost part into the district in about 2.5 days. So basically, even if we have a prolonged rain event, it would be rare for the Potomac River to flood to last more than a handful of days. Now, our office covers most of DC, most of Maryland in this red area that you see here, and we provide the weather and climate forecast and information for the protection of life and property. And how we do that is we essentially provide a traffic-like kind of structure where we issue what's called hazardous weather outlooks. Those are generally 3 to 7 days out, maybe shorter ranges in some cases. We have something called a watch, which is a flood or flash flood or a river flood watch. That's something up to 48 hours or 72 hours for rivers. And then imminently or it's occurring is the warnings. Hold on here, my system. Okay, we're back. Uh-oh. That's not good. So my system is deciding that it wants to lock up. There we go. So watch conditions, what does a watch versus a warning mean? A watch conditions means flooding is possible with a greater than 50% chance. So be alert, it may not be occurring right now. Versus warning, flooding is occurring or is extremely likely to occur, greater than 75% chance, you need to take action now. Watch does not necessarily mean or does not necessarily precede a warning. The types of flood warnings that we have a flood warning, which is generally expected to have a slow rise in the water levels. Water might not be moving as quickly around the roads versus a flash flood warning. That's a rapid and extreme flooding that I talked about. And in some rare cases, maybe 1 to 2 times a year in the area, there's no time to wait. A flash flood emergency will be declared by us. We'll get that word out to the media. And that's a rapid and extreme flooding is occurring and is causing both significant damage and or a threat to life now. In terms of coastal flooding, we have the Coastal Flood Advisory, which is nuisance flooding. That's flooding of parklands, walkways. Then we have coastal flood warning, which means that at least one structure or more is going to be impacted. We issue coastal flood advisories for DC for the entire area, even though it's really going to impact along the tidal coastline. We issue flood warnings using a polygon approach. We limit the area. If you're not in a polygon box, we believe your threat is low. Watches are for the entire district, not a polygon. So reminder, all areas in a polygon are perceived to have an imminent flood threat. In many cases, only a few small areas will actually get that. There are some mitigation projects that have been underway. Did you know we have a levee system in the district? That area in yellow here is essentially an area that's protected by a levee. Here on the north of the reflecting pool, there actually, you can see the ground. There's a high ridge there. And there's actually a levee system where we have on 17th Street, the Park Service will actually put up this barrier across 17th Street, which will essentially close these levees, keep the floodwaters out. There's other mitigation projects. Joint Base Andrews or Anacostia Bowling has one. Georgetown Waterfront Flood Wall, you've probably seen that. And finally, lastly, my last slide here, we're overdue. The last major tidal flood that we experienced was during Isabel in 2003, and nothing's even come close since then. And even worse, the last major Potomac River flooding was back in 1996 in January. Long term, we average about one major flood on the Potomac every 7 years, and we haven't had one in 17 years. So it will happen again. We have to be ready. So remember, turn around and don't drown. Back to you, Brett.
Stephen, thank you so much for that presentation. Very much appreciated. You can stop sharing your screen now. And we will now move, this first presentation has presented the possibility of flood risk. And so now what we want to provide is participants with some answers as far as what they can do to be prepared. How can they be more alert? So what I'm just doing right now is extending to my colleague at the district's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, Kim McCall, has joined us as a presenter. And she's going to be presenting a few slides very briefly on READYDC. And Kim, I've unmuted you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides. Currently, it's in preview mode.
Okay.
Now we're talking. Sounds great.
Okay, now we're talking. Thank you so much for inviting DC Homeland Security EMA to be a part of tonight's discussion. And I would like to exceptionally thank Mr. Zubrick for some great information that we can use to help better prepare our community members. I'm Kim McCall with the DC government at Homeland Security EMA, where our community outreach focus is about preparing our community members for incidents that may happen in DC. So one of the resources that we use a lot is a website and an informational resource guide. It's called READYDC. That started as a campaign back in 2017 to help our community members, all parts of the community, prepare for all types of incidents. Today, we've learned a lot about flooding and how we should avoid it at all cases. What I learned tonight is that actually visibility will have a lot to do with the person possibly being impacted by flooding. So again, that was some great information from the National Weather Service. So what do we want at our website, ready.dc.gov? We want to be able to empower our community members to take protective actions before something happens, or we want to be able to inform community members during the incident. So if we're in the middle of the flood, we want to be able to alert you to let you know what the protective actions are. And then absolutely following any incident in the District of Columbia, we want to be able to recover. So our website again is ready.dc.gov, where we talk about personal action. We want to make our public aware so that they can create their own family plans and organizational plans. We want our community members empowered to build their own disaster kits, have those essential items that would get you and your family members, as well as other community members, sustained during an incident. Primarily food, water. As we heard tonight, visibility could be low, so sometimes having flashlights will be an option. But I would like to add that we should never go through standing water. Drive through it if you're in a car, cycle through it if you're on a bicycle, moped through it, scooter through it. If you are in a motorized wheelchair, do not take a chance at flooded roadways here in the district. So stay informed, because our community actions are about keeping our community members safe and resilient, building emergency preparedness into all of our organizational structures across the city, making sure that we have government continuity so that we can handle floods or any other type of incident. And obviously, we want to work with our community service providers so that they're getting very good information. How can you prepare? 4 simple steps. Be aware, stay plugged into DC government, Homeland Security, EMA, where you can learn what to do before any incident. Build your own disaster kit and make your plans, because these 2 steps will help sustain you when there's lack of services that may come from other resources. So if you're in the home, have a disaster kit. If you're in the workplace, have a disaster kit. Make your plans, make them family friendly, organizational friendly. And don't forget those individuals who will have access and functional needs. Again, there may be folks in wheelchairs that we have to prepare for. Stay informed. At ready.dc.gov, we supply a lot of information, not just about floods, but about earthquake preparedness, but about man-made incidents where there may be a threat to life or injuries to our public. Stay informed, stay plugged in. If you get a chance, please register for Alert DC so that you receive timely emergency notifications and real-time information about things that you can do. Again, empower yourself to be prepared to shelter in place or to evacuate should we need to. Download HCEMA's mobile app to get your emergency alerts, as well as any other important information. Thank you so much for having HCEMA be a part of your event tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Kim, thank you so much for sharing those resources with our attendees. I have personally signed up for Alert DC, and I find it very useful to learn about weather and all sorts of alerts going on in my neighborhood. So do encourage all attendees to utilize that resource. For now, we're going to hold questions till the end of the event. And up next, we have my colleague, Joshua Schnitzlein from DOEE. I'm going to make sure that he has presentation rights. And what he's going to do is present a tool that Stephen had touched on earlier, which is the DC Flood Risk Viewer. Very helpful tool where participants can look up where they live and kind of get an idea of the flood risk that they face. So with that being said, Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, Kim and Stephen. I'm going to be doing a sort of a live demo of the viewer. I'll go ahead and share my screen. As Brent mentioned, I work for DOEE and I work on the flood team here in coordination with the Silver Jackets and Steve and Kim's groups. And so we work out of the National Floodplain Insurance Programs Office. So within FEMA manages the National Flood Insurance Program for states, for communities, and offers access to flood insurance. And so our office works within the floodways of DC to offer that to residents and to provide education, as well as working on outreach and mitigation projects. And one of those projects was to, let's see if I can share here. Am I good, Brent? Okay, great. Thank you. We developed through FEMA funds and in partner with Visonomy, who was our developer for this viewer. Ricardo Savager was our developer. And you can access the DC Flood Risk Viewer in a number of ways. Per Kim's comments, I'm on Flood Ready DC here on our main flood page. You can see you can sign up for the alerts, but you can actually go down here. We have an embedded link for the DOE Flood Risk tool. If you would prefer to, just sort of type in Google, oops, not my Gmail, and just type in DC Flood Risk Viewer. It's the first viewer that'll pop up. You click on that. It's going to take you to a introduction page. You come down to the first link here, DC Flood Risk Tool. You're going to get a nice user guide in the upper right and then an introduction. There's a lot to this tool, both for public sector planners, real estate agents, flood insurers, developers, building permit professionals. This demonstration will primarily be focused for residents. So let's say if you're interested, is my home in a floodplain? Steve was mentioning with the 100-year floodplain, is it regulated by the district? what are those needs going to be looking like? And you can see here in the very beginning of the viewer, I should mention at the beginning too, this is also mobile friendly. So you can also access through Android or your iPhone. But you can see here the areas in blue are donating if the 1% flood. So if we were to have a 100-year flood, 1% chance every year of flooding happening, this is what we regulate to in the district for all of our building code and development. That will be in blue. The 500-year would be in yellow, and that is the 0.5%. So that's going to be would be if there was a real whopper of a storm, would be the yellow, but still equally important to be examining. And then also the floodway, where the actual floodwater will be itself, that's going to kind of be a coral red and cyan layer. And so what you can see on this viewer, you can see here we have the base layer then would be the 100-year and the 500-year floodplain. And there are a few tabs here to look at. So I wanted to focus mainly on the three on the upper left here. We have a flood risk tab, a forecast tab, and a social media tab. I actually want to start with the forecast tab. This is very nice to have on our viewer. What it does is we have stream gauges in the Potomac River at Georgetown, and then also the Washington Channel at the Southwest waterfront. And so you can click on either of these two stream gauges, and it'll give you a real-time, similar to how Steve was mentioning in his presentation, what is happening in real time. So you can see here we have last observed value is 3.47 feet at 6:48 Eastern Standard Time, and you have a timeline at the bottom showing the level and the height of flooding at these river and stream gauges. As you can see here, as it increases into the pink area into major flooding. And so this is a way for folks to just be alert and have access to see if we're having major flooding or not, particularly tidal or storm surge flooding. If you were to click then on the flood risk tab, there's a lot to look over here. But I think the most optimal, if you're a resident, is just to search. So if we just look into a street that is in the 100-year floodplain, say we do Hayes Street, and click on that, it's going to zoom you automatically in to the flooding here. You can see here what we're looking at. The area, the kind of coral, the red, and cyan area, that is the floodway itself. So that is if a flood is happening, that is where the water is flowing. The 100-year here, this blue area, this is where, given a 100-year flood event, this is where the flooding naturally needs to go within the floodplain itself. And these are the areas affected by that flooding. And so what we can do with this viewer is we can go to our infrastructure where there's several tabs. We have a flood tab, which lets you further analyze this layer, this blue layer here. We have a social economic tab that lets you look at, you can overlay this layer with population, the median income of these areas, as well as the housing cost. This is all public information through the DC data website. So we've pooled all this in to make it available. You can also bring in infrastructure, and then you can also bring in political lines. So if you wanted to know what ward this was occurring in, or ANC. And so for this instance, if we were to click on the building layer, for instance, if we were to look at a property, we could click here. It'll zoom us in, and we can see here that we're at in Hay Street. It'll tell us the flood zone. So we have a zone AE, which would be that 100-year regulatory flood. And we'll actually be able to know, given a flood that is that 1% annual chance, how much damage would occur for what the property is assessed at. So we're pulling this out of the DC property assessment. And so, for instance, this home here, if we were to click on this home, we might get a different number. It's $113,000 is the tax assessment. We have some other homes, $210,000. This home here, we have $127,000. And so you get the gist of that. It's pulling it directly from the tax parcel database that we have. And you can click on the building type. We're soon going to be integrating this so residents don't have to. But we have a residential area home. Let's say it's a single family home and it's a 2-story house. And given DC, we have basements. So we have a $315,000 tax assessed home. What our viewer will do is and this will work for any tax assessed property in the district that is in the floodplain. In the bottom left here, you see the estimated structural loss. So if a flood were to affect an area or a property, how much loss would occur as a result of that? And so we've made this available to residents as well as developers to know that, to see, okay, if flooding occurs, what will the actual damage projected be? And this is a projected damage. We can also do an area-based analysis. Say that you wanted to draw a polygon, you wanted to know for an area, and this, again, is only if it's tax assessed properties, if we have the data for it. So I can draw a area here, and we're going to say we have single family homes. We can run an analysis. It tells us which homes are able to be analyzed. And then we can look at the total for all the homes analyzed. We can look at the total structural loss. And so you can see just in a certain block, we have over $1 million of damages. And so it allows us to examine homes that are in need of flood insurance. That's, as a property owner, the best thing that someone can do, even if you're outside of the floodplain. You can get it at, even if you're outside of the floodplain, you can get it at a substantially reduced rate. We've seen more with climate change and sea level rise that more and more homes will be affected. And so we eventually, plan with the tool to be able to open that up to see where homes will be affected all over the district with flood loss. So that's a very interesting tool that we have available for DC residents to examine. It also allows folks to see not only the flood insurance, but potential mitigation actions that they could undergo to reduce those damages. You can also, as I mentioned earlier, we can overlay this. And I should mention too, you can actually click on one of these properties once the report has been analyzed, and it will create a very nice PDF for you. Just a nice printout, sort of a one-page PDF showing the property inside of the floodplain, and then also the flood zone itself, the characteristics of the property, and then so here we go. We have a nice legend. We have the structural loss. That's something that is offered as well. Check my time. Okay. On top of that, if we wanted to look at social economic statistics, we're going to zoom back out and overlaying that with the floodplain. What our viewer, I'm going to refresh real quick. This is a live demo, so things do take some time to load. Let that reload. We have a very nice, crisp viewer. It's very accessible. It doesn't have much lag time. We went to great lines to do that as well. So if we do the social economic, if we look at population, let's see. Overview here. Here we go. So we can see within the floodplain where people live. And so this can also generally be used if people are just curious about population. So it's broken down by census tract, and you can see here it's rather intuitive. The higher the more dense the orange there, the more people, that's where more people live. The less orange, the more opaque, sort of purplish area, that's where less people live. So you can click on any of the census tracts and you can see the population. So for instance, census tract 78.03, we have a population of 4,000. If we click downtown around Chinatown area, Penn Quarter area, we can get a much different population statistic. We can also do this for average housing cost and median income. Very quickly, also with our infrastructure layer, you can click on a variety of options if you wanted to examine what roads are in the floodplain, what metro entrances, charter schools, critical infrastructure. So if we were to click just a variety of these, we have nursing homes, primary care facilities, fire stations, police stations, homeless shelters, hospitals. They all pop up on our map. And so you can even use this. We have several viewers in the district, but if you already happen to be on here looking at flood risk and are curious about it, you can just use this for other means as well. We've tried to make it so that we've integrated as much data as possible. So for instance, we have various metro centers, and you can kind of click on these and it'll tell you, for instance, this is the red line at Union Station. And you can see around here, there is no projected flooding. Some other things that you can do, I'm going to go ahead and click all these off. You can kind of go in and, again, this is all in the flood risk tab. If you
I'm gonna
wanted to
give
know,
you a 1-minute warning here.
okay, that's perfect. If you wanted to know what wards you were in or what ANC you're in, you can click that up here and it'll tell you. With the flooding, the final thing I wanted to look at, if you wanted to know, as Stephen was mentioning with the levees, if you wanted to know where the levee, we have these red lines that come up and they will show you where the levees in the district are. And the final thing I wanted to look at was the 100-year flood depth. So we know generally based on that blue border where the flooding is projected to occur. But as Steve was mentioning, within that 100-year floodplain, what about, is it 10 feet? Is it 20 feet? Is it 1 foot? That's really important to know. So we can just type in, let's say we want to look at the wharf. So we just type in the wharf, it zooms us straight in, and we get all these little dots right here. So we no longer have like just a solid blue floodplain. We have a bunch of dots. And what these are doing is they're looking at the stream gauges and they're looking at the analysis and hydrology, and they're looking at the flood elevation as well as the contours, which you can also look at. We have 2 to 10 foot contours. So if you wanted to look around the fish market, for instance, right here, we're at the wharf, and just click on any of these. They're kind of hard to click on, but once you do, I recommend having a mouse. Right here, if you want to know exactly, if you were walking at the wharf and you want to know exactly what the projected flood depth would be, given a 100-year flood event, 1% chance, it would be exactly 10 feet of flooding. If you were to go anywhere else in the district, in one of those other areas I was showing previously, you could click on that. For instance, right here, as we go down towards Levee, and it actually extends to the actual buildings. I'm just clicking around to show. We have 10.58. We have 9. And so you get the idea. Right here, we have 9. So interesting to note. I would just make a note on that there is fluctuations in the floodplain. If you did want to look at that for anywhere in the district, you can go ahead and do so. And the final thing I will mention too is flood insurance. Again, if you just Google FEMA flood insurance, and I misspelled it, but that's fine. It'll take you there. There's a variety of options for renters, folks already in the floodplain, folks outside of the floodplain, but potentially want to get a reduced rate. We have all information through FEMA here. There's numbers to call and calculators, and you can get that information. But thank you. I'll hand it back over to you, Brett.
Josh, your passion for flooding is infectious. And I love seeing how excited you get with the flood viewers. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And so what I wanted to offer now that we have these 3 presentations wrapped up, we got a little bit of time here for questions and answers. So I would encourage you can type those in the chat, or also actually the WebEx system we're using now has a Q&A section. And actually, we've already received some questions and answers there. So I will share with the larger group the first question we got, which is, does READYDC reaching out to elderly or underserved residents that may or may not be tech savvy, have internet access or a smartphone? And Kim was very helpful with a great answer for that. And in response, she said, we look for opportunities to collaborate with DC agencies such as DC Office of Aging, as well as community-based service providers and organizations that serve people disabled with access or functional needs. And so HCMA does conduct outreach, specifically also with the faith communities across the city. Other community support comes from ANC Advisory Neighborhood Commissioners. And so HCMA is always looking to develop those relationships. And I wanted to offer, if Kim had anything more she wanted to add to that, so I'm not speaking on her behalf. Are you good? Okay, cool. I think I covered it there. Excellent. So we also got another great question that I think might be a couple part. So the question was, with regard to storm surge flooding, what educational resources, namely brochures, are available with regard to storm drains and the importance of keeping openings of storm drains clear of debris, especially yard debris? So regarding that question, regarding storm drains, as any neighborhood that you live in, it's so important that those are maintained and clear. So what I will share with you is a resource that I have found effective. And so DC Water manages the city's storm drains. So if you ever do see one that is blocked or needs repair or cleaning, DC Water is the agency to contact. And what I put in the Q&A section is a link to DC Water's Report a Problem page. And I actually just did this the other month. I had a blocked drain. And it was, once I submitted it, it was cleaned within 2 days. So they're very responsive because they take that very seriously, because that can lead to localized flooding. So, and DC Water will have more information on regarding storm drains. Now, in the event of storm drains being blocked and then storm surge flooding are very different things. And I was curious, Josh, maybe you could touch on this. When there's a storm surge, would the sewer system in that case also be getting overwhelmed? Like, is that such a large amount of water, or can the sewer system help absorb and take the burden from some of that?
Oh, my computer is lagging.
Not a problem. We can still hear you.
Oh, you can?
Yep.
Okay, good. I was making sure I was not muted there. Well, I mean, if you look at in the case of the Ellicott City flood, there was so much water that came into that area that it in my opinion, it didn't really matter anyway. Like, there were so many gallons and gallons of water that it was a bit minuscule of how good the sewer system was going to be, given the storm surge. It certainly can mitigate it, but if you have a flood rising to that level, where we have massive storm surges from coastal flooding anyway, it's going to be more minimal. I mean, in an urban area where you do have, you're consistently attempting to update your sewer systems, certainly. But if you're going to get a flood that we had in Texas or are receiving in Texas currently, or the Ellicott City floods, at that point, in my opinion, it sort of kind of negates it. I mean, you're going to get so much gallons and gallons of water anyway. So you're really, with that sort of flood, I mean, I don't know, Steve, if you have any comments as well on that.
But perhaps in general, to avoid any kind of localized temporary flooding, always keep an eye on your storm drains and make sure those do stay cleared. But in certain instances, there is so much water that they're not going to save you. So another thing, Josh, that we did get a question on regarding the flood risk viewer. Does it take into account the impact of climate change on the 100-year flood risk assessment? Like, has that been updated recently? And then the second question I wanted to ask you is, that flood risk viewer, it sounds like it covers coastal and riverine flooding. Does it cover localized or flash flooding? Or interior flooding, I guess, is a better question.
The district is currently working on interior flooding. We're actually working on a interior flood model that will be mapping all of that interior flooding. So, if you have nuisance flooding, I'm sharing my screen here. So, say we have flooding up, let's just take, for example, around Catholic University here, or say we get it, as I zoom in here, around this area. Flooding certainly is going to occur given backups in sewer systems, given the amount of asphalt that we have. Obviously, the district is attempting as best as we can to do green infrastructure to soak that water up, but we're naturally going to be getting that due to being a more urban area. And when I mean urban, I mean highly dense area with all of our infrastructure. And so we are going to be mapping that so residents have a clearer picture. We're not currently obviously regulating to that level. This viewer is particularly just showing what we're looking at regulating to.
And does that new 100-year level reflect more recent projections for climate change? Like, I guess, when was that level baseline last updated in the model?
Yes, we had in 2010, we had our study of this area, and then we had a restudy done in 2016 that took into account, essentially looked at the Federal Triangle area. Let me bring that back up, which is this area here with our levee systems. And so we obviously have, with the Resilient DC guidelines, we're looking at climate change and sea level rise. This layer particularly itself was last updated in 2010 for the entire restudy of the area. What we can do is we have what is called a LOMAR process, which is a letter of map revision. And so as we get better data through modeling, we're able to, I don't want to say like piecemeal necessarily. We're not going to re-study the entire floodplain, but what we will do in working with the Army Corps and FEMA, kind of working directly with FEMA on updating this mapping, we can kind of do certain sections as we get better data to either reduce the floodplain in some cases, if it's more accurate, or increase the floodplain in other cases.
Okay. And another question we got is, regarding the layer that you have on the map for infrastructure, does the data include the age of infrastructure? And it looks like that's probably not something that's easily visible. It's probably it just shows where the infrastructure is located, correct?
When I zoom in here, we have two different building layer tabs, and these are pulled from the DC, I believe it's the DC data, it's called the clearinghouse. And so you can look at so I zoom right back in here. You can look at the building layer itself, and then you can look at the lot. So if I click on take off the building, so you can look at the lot itself, and then you can look at the actual building footprint. So I believe for this viewer, if you click here, it's just going to give you, we're actually automating this as well, so that the building type and occupancy type, we already have this data, so we're actually going to automate this so people don't have to select it. But if you go to the actual, and you can just Google this, if you just Google parcel viewer DC or Office of Planning parcel viewer, it'll pull that up, and you can do the same thing. You can click on it, and it'll give you extended property characteristics for the age of the building, that sort of thing. For this viewer itself, we're just really looking at, are you in it or are you not? What is your tax assessment looking at? I certainly think that's something we can incorporate in future iterations of the process.
So Josh, while we have you on the line, we have a couple more questions here. Marcia wrote in to say, how often is the assessment value updated? She says she's looking at her home and it's way off.
Yeah, I guess
it's more of a question for the Office of Taxation.
Yeah, I don't know that answer 100%. I know that it's certainly updated every night. Like I understand that, like the database isn't, like they're not taking the actual database. I think it's updated every night. I'll have to double check on that. But in terms of when people are going out and doing an assessment, if your property's worth it's X amount of money, I guess the question would be, when is it going to be worth X amount of money, a year from now? I don't know the answer to that. We could certainly get back to Marcia on that and check in with people. That would, unfortunately, that's not through our office, so I don't have a direct answer.
Yeah, that's perhaps a better question for the Office of Taxation. All right, I got one more question for you, Josh. And Curtis Glover wrote in to ask, how have construction design regulations changed in response to perhaps expansions or developments of floodplain regulations?
Yeah, so we're currently going through our process with we're updating the DC flood hazard rules. So if you're in, like, even if you don't have a property, like say you want to build, we get this a lot with around the Wharf area here, or down by Southwest. Say you want to develop a property here, you can't just, if it's like 1890, sure, but when we had the regulations come in place, you can't just develop a building. You have to have it set to a certain height. There's a freeboard requirement. We have additional height above that. You have different materials that you must make the building out of. You have to, with your utilities, elevation, all those sort of things are happening. We're currently going through the process of updating all of that. Actually, Martin Cook from our office is sort of leading that effort. And so I'm more than happy to put you in touch with him. If I can actually, it's Martin martin.koch at dc.gov, and he's leading that effort. I think he would be able to speak more clearly. I know he'd be happy to do that. I'm not putting him on the spot, but if get in contact more directly with him. But the answer is yes. I mean, that's certainly with building development. DOEE, just from a procedural standpoint, DOEE approves that. So if a property is put on the sort of the conveyor belt, it has to go from A to B. It goes to DCRA, which is they're a building authority. They approve all the building permits. At a certain part in the process, it will get triggered if it's in the floodplain, if it's in that regulatory area. It then comes to DOEE, and we look at it and revise it and say, okay, was the development permit for a new construction, has it met the requirements of the floodplain development? If it hasn't, then that's a discussion to have with the property developer or whoever submitted the permit. And then, we have to make sure it clears that before we can then submit that through to DCRA for the rest of the process.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I wanted to give an update to the question about climate change. My colleague at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers added the clarification that the map viewer does not include climate change as far as projected into the future. It only will show the current risk as it exists. So thank you. So Stacy, thank you so much for that clarification. Let's see what other questions go on.
I'm happy to add one final thing that I didn't share too about the viewer, which is really neat that we added in. I actually had a slide on it because I just searched for it now and we actually didn't have any tweets, because it's a 5-day cycle. So if you're not getting a massive amount of flooding, people aren't going to tweet about it. But one of the neat things we have, this is a screenshot you can see on my PowerPoint here. If you click the social media tab, we have search terms set up. And anytime anybody in the district has location sharing, and they tweet out, flooding, basement flooded, my car got flooded down, something like that, it'll tag it in these black dots, and it'll tag it in the time and the location that it occurred. You can click on that, see the tweet, and you can actually click, and it'll go directly to the tweet. So that's also something neat that, trying to capture that data. This one in particular said that the flooding has receded and roadway was reopened around Rock Creek Park in that area. So just another kind of neat thing we've been trying to integrate with recent social media trends.
Got it. Thank you. And I wanted to circle back on Marsha Roberts' question because someone had added, Glenn had added a helpful, perhaps explainer, in that the value might just be representative of the structure value, as land is not insurable and you're not going to lose your land in a flood, ideally. So, Glenn, thank you so much for that clarification. I guess this might be another one for Josh. What intensity storm are the newest storm system construction projects designed to receive? Okay, so actually this might be related to, so we're gonna do 2 questions here that, I don't even know. So there is a new tunnel system that is being built under the city's rivers that are meant to avoid sewer overflow events that are the result of large storm, water surges going into the sewer system. So the question is, can anyone speak to the current status of DC Water's tunnel project and its effect on DC's flood preparedness? And then we had a related question that spoke to the newest storm system construction projects. What is the intensity of storm they're designed to receive in a day or in an hour? Josh, do you feel qualified to answer that question? Or Steve? We'll throw it out to the whole panel.
Well, I would again, I drop Martin's into the chat there. I think any questions about that, you're more than happy to email Martin directly, and he can respond because he's really leading the effort on the new updates to the regulations, and he can speak with you directly about that. I don't know if he's on tonight, but I think that would be he'd be the best person to speak to, unless.
Not a problem. We can circle back with some of these questions that might be a little bit outside of the mandate. But what I did want to share with those who asked that question is, I'm going to put a link in here for, again, DC Water's website. And you can learn more about the current progress they are making in their project. But as last I knew, the tunnels that largely are taking care of, sewer system overflow events that typically used to happen throughout the Northeast in DC. So the Anacostia River Tunnel, and then there's an extension of that, the Northeast Branch Tunnel. The Anacostia Tunnel is operational. The Northeast Branch Tunnel has finished construction. I do not believe it has been commissioned yet. And then there are projections for a tunnel to go in under the Potomac River, but that has not yet started construction. I believe they're still in design. Anyway, I'm going to put a link to that project there to that question.
I will say for the proposed update, we do have a tidal shoreline buffer. So areas inundated by the sea level rise by 2100. The proposed update, and again, Martin can speak directly to this if folks can email him directly. It's the projected the high flood plus 6 feet, which is taking into account for the NOAA projections for sea level rise. And so there's a tidal shoreline buffer that is in the works for that.
Got it.
If that's helpful, but
Well, I believe we have tackled all the questions that we got in. We did get one that I think is an interesting question, and Josh, your passion for maps may shine through here. Does the risk viewer map include the probability of trees impacted by flooding, and especially in areas with old trees?
That is an excellent question, and the answer, I don't think, I can check back in with Razan on that, but I honestly don't think that we
Technology
looked at
has
that.
its limits, huh?
I will say just broadly, so we had an old viewer. So you have like FEMA's viewer, right? You got like the FEMA National Flood Viewer, which is kind of like once a map and a restudy or a study gets done for a community, it's put there. Every community tries to do its own. So we've recently, within the last year or two, really tried to make this mobile friendly, very interactive, taking all the DC specific data to the viewer. And we're looking forward to increasing it and utilizing funding. It's federal funding, and I'm going to keep a note of that because I think it's a really interesting thing to look at. So thank you for whoever brought that up. But that's not something I don't believe currently in the viewer though.
Got it. So another question that we did have, and Josh, maybe you could speak briefly to this. And we appreciate everyone who's still with us. We have gone over our time, but we're going to try to get you out of here. But those who stuck around clearly are interested, so we're happy you're here. So I wanted to share that on Thursday at 4 o'clock, we're having an event tailored specifically to flood insurance in the district. And that's going to be hosted with our colleagues at the Department of Insurance, Securities, and Banking. And so that'll be everything you need to know about flood insurance in the district. That being said, we did get 2 questions that asked to clarify what flood insurance does and it does not cover. And then also, are there programs available for residents to receive financial aid when working to reduce their flood risk? Again, we're having an event specifically on this on Thursday, but Josh, off the top of your head, do you have any questions or answers for those questions?
Sure. So with flood insurance, there's several ways to acquire it. I'll speak most, if you have a mortgage on a property in the 100-year floodplain, if you're in that blue area there and you have a mortgage that you're paying through, your lender, most likely you should be required. You are. That's the law is you're required to have flood insurance for that property. Currently we do not have a process in place to do a direct subsidy, although it is something we're examining, as are other areas. But for flood insurance direct, so you can also do private flood insurance as well. It's something to look at. But for the NFIP, if you go to floodsmart.gov, you can look at all what's covered and what's not covered. As I mentioned before, you can get flood insurance outside of the floodplain too, if you want to get covered, and it's substantially reduced. So you have building coverage and you have content coverage. So for building coverage, you're looking at electrical and plumbing systems, furnaces and water heaters, refrigerators, cook stoves, built-in appliances like dishwashers, permanently installed carpeting, cabinets, paneling, bookcases, window blinds, foundation walls, anchorage systems, staircases, detached garages, fuel tanks, pump tanks, even solar energy. For contents, you're looking at personal belongings like clothing, furniture, electrical equipment, curtains, washers, dryers, portable and window air conditioners, microwave ovens, carpets that wouldn't be included in building coverage, like carpet installed over wood floors. Any valuable items such as artwork, I think that's up to like $2,500. Again, like if you just Google floodsmart.gov, you can look at the limits of that coverage, like what you can and can't do. There's you can also look at there's calculators to let you know what's not covered. The cause of the flood matters in that case. So flood insurance covers losses directly caused by flooding. So a flood is an excess of water on land that is normally dry, affecting 2 or more acres of land on 2 or more properties. And so, one of the things we struggle with in the district is if you get nuisance flooding, you're trying to kind of prove that through a flood event. An example is say you get damage caused by a sewer backup, and that would be covered if the backup is a direct result of flooding. If the sewer backup is not caused directly by flooding, the damage wouldn't be covered, or you'd have to be able to prove it through newspaper articles or something like that. And so It does get a little tricky. I would certainly recommend, calling our office and talking about it further. I think it's a specifically too more case by case if people are wondering about that. And then, as I mentioned, floodsmart.gov has a ton of information. You can call and talk directly with a flood insurer and an agent. So
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. Well, I think we've answered all the questions that we have for tonight. So I would like to thank all my fellow panelists for joining us this evening. Really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to be part of DC Flood Awareness Week. For those attendees who join us, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking time out of your evening. Please join us throughout the week. You can visit ready.dc.gov/floodweek to learn all about the other programming that we have coming up this week. Our next event is going to be Wednesday night, and that will be a history of flooding in the district. Very excited about that. And then Thursday, we have two events. We have a live stream demonstration of flood barrier technologies, and we also have a flood insurance forum as well. Then Friday, DC Water is doing a pop-up event in Ward 4. And then finally, we're doing kind of a social media awareness campaign throughout the day on Friday. So welcome to DC Flood Awareness Week. And with that, I will bid you all a wonderful evening and hope to see you at the next one. Cheers. Take care.